Afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. You're all very welcome. My name is James Lonergan, Director of Education here with the SCSI. Just like to welcome our members and also our guests, students and lecturers from DIT and from NUI Maynooth. You're all very welcome. Just before we introduce our speakers, just a couple of housekeeping issues. If you could put phones on silent, please. And just to note, we have exits at the top of the room here and also at the back. I'd like to welcome our speakers today, April McClements and Christine Woods from Matheson's. Very welcome. April McClements is a partner in the Insurance and Dispute Resolution team at Matheson. April is a commercial litigator and specialises in insurance disputes. She supports clients across a range of industries in relation to the entire spectrum of insurance-related issues. April advises insurance companies and corporate policyholders on policy wording, interpretation and drafting, complex coverage disputes, D&O claims, cyber, emerging risks and subrogation claims. She also provides gap analysis advice for policyholders and underwriters where there are multiple policies covering similar risks. April manages professional indemnity claims for a variety of professionals, including surveyors, architects, engineers and their insurers. April also works in the area of general commercial litigation with a particular focus on contractual disputes, most of which are litigated in the commercial court. She is also a strong advocate of ADR and has acted for clients in mediations and arbitration. April is recognised by Intelligent Insurer as one of the influential women in insurance and reinsurance of 2017 and by the Euromoney Women in Business Law Expert Guide. Christine Woods is a Senior Associate in the Technology and Innovation Group at Matheson. Christine advises clients from a diverse spread of industry sectors on a range of data protection, e-commerce, intellectual property and information technology issues. Christine has particular experience in advising local and international companies on their data processing and cyber security requirements, including on processing arrangements and data transfers, data breaches, data subject access requests and the implementation of GDPR. Christine also has extensive experience in drafting, structuring and negotiating a wide variety of commercial and contractual arrangements for companies in the financial services, technology and life sciences areas, including commercial contracts for the supply of goods and services, outsourcing arrangements, privacy policies, website terms of use, manufacturing and supply agreements, distribution agreements, franchise agreements, outsourcing agreements, software licenses and IP assignments. Christine regularly presents on topics within her areas of expertise, in particular on the key components and principles under the GDPR. So safe to say there's plenty of expertise in the room today. So thank you again, you're very welcome. Just before I hand over, one final thing just to mention, we are recording the lecture today. None of you will be on tape or recording, but just to be aware that the session is being recorded. Thank you. Over to you.
Thanks, James. Good afternoon, everyone. Delighted to be here to talk to you today about drones and some legal issues to think about before taking off. So drones have a number of names: remotely piloted aircraft, small unmanned aircraft, unmanned aerial vehicles. Whatever you call them, there's no doubt that the non-military, commercial, recreational drone use is really taking off, and this is a rapidly growing market. Lloyd's published a report in 2015 that found that global expenditure on drone acquisition is expected to double to $91 billion in the 10 years to 2024. And in Ireland alone, more than 8,000 drones have been registered with the IIA as of November 2017, and that's since December 2015. And the IIA actually expects that figure to exceed 10,000 drones this year. The drones are really becoming part of the day-to-day operations for many modern businesses, in particular in your industry, and I don't need to tell you that. However, it's still very much an emerging and developing technology. Drones are getting smaller, lighter, airspaces are getting more crowded, and regulation really has to develop quickly to keep up with the technology. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the existing regulation and also reform of regulation and what's on the horizon. This is a picture I like showing whenever I talk about drones. It's one I took myself Christmas 2016 up at Fanad Lighthouse up in North Donegal. And what really struck me was that I was in a very remote part of the country, and there's a sign that says no drones allowed without prior permission. And yet while I was there was a drone flying around the lighthouse. I'm assuming, with permission. But I think it just shows, the prevalence of drones and how really they really are spreading and across the country. I don't need to tell you that the sky is the limit when it comes to drone use. In your own industry, I know they're being used in mapping and surveying and creating efficiencies, and there's benefits from a health and safety perspective. They're widely used in the construction industry, more widely for things like examining cladding, detecting heat loss, detecting structural issues, and they're also used for things like monitoring assets, asset inspections. You may have heard Transport Infrastructure Ireland recently announced that it wants to use drones to monitor motorways and the Lewis tracks, to be able to assess damage a little bit quicker and to avoid road closure. Widely used in industries like photography and filming. Drone delivery services are absolutely on the way, and Amazon have said their aim is to provide the 30-minute delivery service, which is somewhat staggering, I think. In February 2017, actually, we had the first authorised drone delivery in Ireland, and that was by Pony Express, who delivered medical supplies to a ship off the coast of Dublin. So all of these uses are, they're there, and drones are really becoming a part of commercial life in Ireland. Every day there's a news report reporting on another novel use for drones. They also have their illegitimate uses. Drones can go where they shouldn't. So for every novel, exciting, new legitimate use, you have the other side of it. So in Japan, they're using police drones with large nets to capture drones flying where they shouldn't go. And this is something that I think we're really going to see over the next while, the development of technology to stop drones going where they shouldn't be. We have the development of tracking and monitoring, and that's something that's been used quite widely, particularly in Switzerland have announced recently that they're bringing this in, and also geofencing technology to stop drones going where they shouldn't be. There's been lots of instances of drones delivering drugs, phones into prisons. They also can cause problems when it comes to things like search and rescue efforts, emergency services, and in the recent US wildfires, actually the presence of drones in the sky meant that the aircraft that were fighting the fires had to be grounded because of risks to the aircraft. As recently as this week, actually, the IAA have designated a temporary no-fly zone over an area in Cork where the Gardaí are carrying out a search for Tina Satchwell, again because drones are flying into space that they shouldn't be in. Finally, drones are very vulnerable to cyber attack and to what's known as skyjacking. And there's been reports that suggest that there is a whole industry of drone hackers out there taking control of drones for illegitimate uses. And again, it's something that's very hard to A, detect, and B, to prevent. Just looking at some of the risks associated with drones, and again, this comes from the Lloyd's Emerging Risk Report when they looked at it from the perspective of insuring drones. And there are things really, from your perspective, to keep in mind in terms of drone use. So you have the negligent or reckless pilots, the human factor, and that really can be just as little as the moral hazard associated with the fact that you have a pilot on the ground who's disassociated from the risk in the air, and they're not putting themselves at risk, and there's risks associated with that. So training and licensing is really key. Patchy regulatory regimes and poor enforcement. Well, in Ireland, we're probably doing pretty well on regulation, potentially even ahead of the game, but we're poor in enforcement. And there's been very little in terms of enforcement in Ireland. And really, as this is such a rapidly growing industry, it presents such challenges for regulators to keep up in terms of regulation and enforcement. I mentioned vulnerability to cyber attack and skyjacking, so cyber security measures are something that are really important. Privacy infringements, that's something that Christine is going to talk a little bit more about. And then you have the issues that come from the increasingly overloaded airspaces, the risk of a collision with a manned aircraft, the risk just of the pace of technology and whether regulation can keep up and whether regulation can stay current and applicable. Battery efficiency is a huge risk. It seems like a really obvious one, but if battery goes, drone falls out of the sky, that can cause a lot of damage. And then you have the identification of drone operators and tracking, which again is a big issue when it comes to regulation. and enforcement. So in terms of regulation in Ireland, and what are the regulations now? At the moment, drone regulation is governed at a national level for drones up to 150 kilograms. Above 150 kilograms, which is, as you know, a fairly sizable drone, it's governed at an EU level by EASA, the European Aviation Safety Agency. So really we're concerned with drones that are smaller than that. And the main piece of regulation is the Small Unmanned Aircraft, Drones and Rocket Order that came in December 2015. So we'll focus on that, and I'm also going to talk about the Small Unmanned Aircraft Drones Bill, which is a piece of legislation that's proposed. It's just a bill at the moment. But I suppose the important point to note is that there are different rules that apply across the EU, although there are similarities between them. So a lot of the limitations that apply to drone use are similar in different jurisdictions. But if you're a drone operator and you're operating in different jurisdictions, you have to go and comply with the regulations in different jurisdictions and get the authorisations that you need. There's not currently a cross-border mechanism there. So the drones order in Ireland is very much based on the weight of a drone, and that's what determines whether it's captured by the regulations and how the regulations are applied. And so where you have a drone that is less than a kilo, the regulations don't apply where it's operating below 15 metres above ground and it doesn't create a hazard. If it's above a kilo, so bag of sugar, it must be registered with the IAA. When you get above 4 kilos, and I'm told that 4 kilos is the weight of the average domestic cat. I don't know, I haven't tested it. But it could also be, say a newborn baby. So again, it's not very significant. The drone must be registered with the IAA and the operator has to undertake a safety training course. When you get above 25 kilos, again, the drone must still be registered, but you need the special operating permission from the IAA. So 25 kilos, that might be your check-in luggage, although they're certainly getting smaller, so 25 kilos might be a bit generous. And as I said, once you get above 150, then you're into the European regulations. The IAA's powers are set out under the drones order, but really they are quite limited. So in terms of what the IAA can do, it can investigate an incident which caused or could have caused a hazard effect on the operation of aircraft. It can prevent a drone flying, or it can detain a drone if it believes a contravention of the order is likely or intended. It can obtain documents and records from a drone operator. It can revoke, suspend or limit any permission or authorisation. But there are no criminal sanctions or penalties for breaches set out in the order. So really, the IAA's enforcement powers under the order are quite limited. They've been described by commentators as toothless because really there's not a huge amount that the IAA can do. So at the moment, the power to penalise for unauthorised drone use lies with the Gardaí and with the judiciary. And it has been reported actually that there's been one successful prosecution for illegitimate drone use by the Gardaí, and that was apparently under the Aviation Act. But there's no details available on that prosecution. And it's reported that that was one out of 94 complaints that were made to Gardaí in the period 2015 to 2017. So you can see it really is, given the number of drones that are registered, and then the number of drones that are actually in use, it's quite a low number. That's quite a stark contrast to the UK, which again hasn't had a huge amount of enforcement, but certainly has had quite a number of cases that have been reported where there's been various prosecutions taken against drone operators for various things. Obviously, just to keep in mind, the full remit of civil and criminal law does apply to drone users. So just because it's not set out in the drones order doesn't mean that drone operators aren't subject to things like privacy law and data protection, and that's something that Christine is going to touch on. this is a graphic from the IAA's website, but actually it sets out the statutory limits that are in the drones order. And the purpose of these limits really is to segregate drones from manned aircraft, and so they're very much prepared with that in mind. And effectively, drones can't be flown out of the direct line of sight of the operator, further away than 300 metres from the operator, or more than 120 metres above ground level. They can't be flown within 30 metres of a person, vessel or structure that's not within the control of the operator or over assemblies of people. They can't be flown closer than 5 kilometres to an aerodrome or in civil or military controlled or restricted areas. And they can't be flown in a way as to cause a hazard to an aircraft or a negligent or reckless way so as to endanger life or property. So they are, when we talk about the statutory limits that apply to drone use, they are the statutory limits that we're talking about. And as I said, they are quite similar to the limitations that apply in other European jurisdictions. When it comes to commercial drone use, under the drones order, you don't require a specific permission for commercial use. However, what you do require is a special operating permission to fly outside the statutory limits. So if you want to fly anywhere that's outside these restrictions, you need a special operating permission. Similarly, drones aren't allowed to be used to drop any item. So if you want to be able to drop things from a drone, you need the permission of the IAA. And if you want to operate a drone that's greater than 25 kilos, again, you need a special operating permission. And the special operating permission procedure recognises that really those limits are restrictive for commercial use. And it would be very difficult for commercial drone operators in particular fields to be able to operate within those limits. And it also recognises that special operating permission holders have to go through various things like training and should be able to operate in a safe way. And the IAA have said that there are currently approximately 130 drone operators in Ireland who are licensed with special permission to operate drones. In order to get a special operating permission, you have to apply to the IAA. To back up the application, you have to complete a safety course at an SUA registered training facility. And also there's an obligation to carry out ongoing refresher renewal training. You have to operate in accordance with a procedures manual that's approved by the IAA, so it's something you prepare yourself, and there's minimum content specified by the IAA that they will then review and approve. And SOP operators are required to hold pilot competency certificates or to use someone who has such a certificate. And again, there's around 170 of these in Ireland at the moment, according to the IAA. While there isn't a requirement under the drones order to have insurance cover, the IAA do require SOP holders to have insurance cover, so that's another requirement. And really the extent of the special operating permission that will be granted by the IAA depends on the procedures and risk assessments that are set out in the operations manual, and also the operator's ability to be able to operate in accordance with those procedures. So it's quite in terms of a process, it does very much turn on the individual operators and their manuals. I mentioned there is reform on the horizon, and firstly in Ireland this is the Small Unmanned Aircraft Drones Bill 2017. Now this was published in July 2017 as a private member's bill, and it hasn't been progressed in the meantime. But what is proposed under this bill is really increased drone regulation. And for the first time, it's introducing criminal liability for certain drone offences. It's reducing the weight threshold for registration, so it's proposed that any drone over 250 grams would be registered. And again, this is in recognition of the fact that as the technology develops, drones are getting smaller and smaller. There's also a requirement that any drone capable of recording images has to be registered. So it's not subject to the 250 grams. So no matter how small your drone is, if it has a camera, if it can record images, it would have to be registered. The registration certificate has to be attached to the drone, And again, this is an attempt to seek to address the issues that there have been around identification and traceability of drones, and it allows for better enforcement. There's also a prohibition on the use of drones for surveillance, capturing images, videos against persons or property where there's a reasonable expectation of privacy and without that person's consent. There is an exemption under this for police and defence force drones. And what's interesting actually about that particular provision is it attracts civil liability as opposed to criminal liability, whereas there are a number of other criminal offences set out in the bill. So, for example, operating a drone without registration would be a criminal offence. Altering or overriding geofencing restrictions in drones. Use of drones for criminal use, which obviously should be a criminal offence, also attracts criminal liability. And also, very interestingly, use of drones for commercial use without insurance will be a criminal offence, and that's something that commercial drone operators will really need to keep an eye on. And it makes insurance for commercial use compulsory for the first time, although, as I said, in practice the IAA is requiring insurance for commercial operators already. So there's no timeline for implementation of this bill. It remains to be seen whether it will be enacted at all, or if it will, whether it will be enacted in this form. But it's interesting to see that this is where regulation seems to be going, certainly with a focus on increased regulation, reduced weights, and the introduction of criminal liability is all very new in this space. So at a European level, as I said, currently drones are governed at a national level up to 150 grams or 150 kilos. So what you do have at a European level is there are insurance requirements currently for drones that weigh more than 20 kilos. And there's also a regulation in relation to reporting certain aviation incidents. But the basic regulation, which gives the EASA a mandate to regulate civil drones greater than 150 kilos, has actually recently been extended. So the EU competence to regulate drones was extended in December 2017 to all drones. So it's now proposed that EASA will have a mandate for all drones regardless of weight, and it will no longer be governed solely at a national level. And there is a new European regulatory framework proposed to go with that. So there's currently there's a draft EU regulation to introduce EU-wide rules for drones, and it's expected that this will be adopted by the EU Commission by the end of 2018. As I said, this is the first EU-wide rules on drone safety, and really it's intended to harmonise legislation across the EU and allow cross-border operations, so that you have drone operators operating in different jurisdictions. They don't need to get authorisations, for example, in different places, and that the same rules will apply to all drone operators. Interestingly, the draft EU regulation focuses on conditions of use and risk rather than on drone rate. So while it does introduce compulsory registration for drones that are greater than 250 grams, in terms of categories, there's two categories set out in the regulation, and they're open and specific, and they're very much, the rules that will apply to drone operators in those categories very much depend on what is the level of risk associated with that drone operator, relating to things like where you're flying. And where you are in the specific category, you'll be required to have an authorisation for every operation, so for every flight, and you have to carry out a risk assessment for every flight, whereas the operators who are in the open category won't have to do that. It's going to introduce geofencing in the vicinity of passenger planes. So again, really focusing on restricting the ability of drones to get into areas where there's manned aircraft, and to try and mitigate that risk of a collision with the passenger plane. And interestingly, it's going to combine product and aviation legislation. So it's introducing technical standards and CE standards for drones and drone manufacturers. In terms of where this regulation currently is, EASA published an opinion in February that was published after a significant consultation with stakeholders based on the initial draft regulation that was published. That opinion has now been submitted to the EU Commission, and it's going to be the technical basis for the EU Commission to prepare EU regulations, which, as I said, are expected by the end of this year. So while we don't know what's going to happen with the drones bill and whether it's going to be implemented at all or in its current form, it does certainly seem that by the end of this year there will be a new European regulatory framework in place that will apply to all drone operators. Just touching on drone insurance. So is drone insurance compulsory? And the short answer is it depends, because at the moment it's recommended by the IAA for all drone operators, but it's not compulsory when you're operating within the statutory limits. However, as I said, SOP holders are required to have insurance, and that's cover for third-party liability, so the risk of injury or damage to third parties. And in terms of the limits that you have to have in your insurance cover, the IIA say that they should be proportionate to the scope and nature of intended use and operation. So again, it's fairly bespoke at the moment. As I mentioned, there is compulsory insurance at an EU level for drones that are greater than 20 kilos. Again, this is for third-party liability, and there's a minimum level of cover of 660,000 required. And as I said, the drones bill is proposing compulsory insurance in Ireland for commercial drone use. So that's the current state of play in terms of insurance and what's required. In terms of things to think about when you're buying drone insurance, and this is very much not an exhaustive list, but just some considerations and things to take into account. It really depends in terms of kind of the activities that you're involved in, but do you need first-party cover, third-party liability? So first-party is damage, generally damage to the drone itself, damage to your own property, or it is the risk to third parties. There's various different types of cover that are available on the market, and again, it depends on what you require. Aviation liability is what's required at an EU level, together with public liability, so that's the category of drones that are greater than 20 kilos. And aviation liability covers things like war, terrorism, hijacking. Public liability covers things like personal injuries to third parties or property damage to third parties. Other covers that you may need or need to consider are things like professional indemnity cover, and whether, so for errors, acts, omissions, negligence associated with the drone use. And that may also cover things like data protection issues. So again, it's to consider, your existing professional indemnity policy, is it covered, is it not, do you need a standalone policy? And employers' liability, if you have employees who are involved in the operation of drones, it's likely something that you're going to need. Cover for equipment is obviously another very important one, because some drones carry very expensive equipment, and you need to make sure obviously that that's insured as well. And sometimes drones may be carrying equipment that belongs to someone else, and again, you need to consider what's the position with the insurance of that equipment and whose policy is it covered under. There's then the debate is, do you get a standalone drone policy, or do you have cover under existing policies? And I think in most instances people are probably going for standalone policies, but I think if you are looking at your existing policies and considering, do you have cover for drone use, the one thing that I would say is look at your exclusions, and is there an aircraft exclusion? Because particularly, say, professional indemnity policies will quite often have an aircraft exclusion, and you need to look at the definition of aircraft, because in most of the ones that I've looked at, it tends to cover drones. So you need to just make sure that you're covered and you don't get cut out. In terms of some of the exposures and things to consider that you might need cover for, so again, it depends on what the drone is being used for, but theft of drone equipment, damage to the drone, and anecdotally I've heard that when drones are damaged, they tend to be a complete write-off, so that can be a significant loss. property damage, so damage to your own property, damage to property of someone else. Then the next two are the two that I would see as being the big ones. So the risk of personal injury caused by the drone, particularly to a third party, and also the potential for a collision with a manned aircraft, because that could be a very catastrophic accident. Cyber risk, hacking and terrorism, again, is something I think we're going to see more of, and again, whether it's something that's covered under a drones policy or a cyber policy is something to consider, but it's certainly, there is the capability there for drones to be to be hijacked and to be used for any number of things. And then there's obviously the things like contractual liability, privacy, nuisance, trespass, and professional indemnity issues. So these are just things to really think about, and potential exposures and what you might need insurance for. I've given a couple of headlines. As I said, the two big ones that I would see would be the personal injury and the collision with the manned aircraft. And so these are all personal injury headlines and things that have happened. They're all outside Ireland, but I think it's probably only a matter of time before we see reported incidents of serious accidents involving third parties and drones. I won't go through them, but the most serious one there is the last one. UK toddler Oscar Webb. So that was an 18-month-old toddler who lost his eye when he was hit by a racing drone that flew out of control. So drones do have the capability to do very serious damage to people and to cause serious personal injuries. So it's always something to be aware of. And as I said, the other big one is near misses with manned aircraft. And obviously this depends on where you're operating and what you're doing, because drones generally shouldn't be operating in the vicinity of manned aircraft. Particularly, if you're someone who's operating in accordance, for commercial use and you have a special operating permission, you really probably shouldn't be anywhere near manned aircraft. But that said, there have been plenty of incidents of near misses with manned aircraft, and these are just a few of the examples. Actually, the UK Civil Aviation Authority reported in 2017 that there had been 70 near misses with aircraft across the UK, and that in that year near misses at Heathrow had tripled in just 1 year. We also had in April 2017 an incident where flights were disrupted at Cork Airport because there was a drone flying over the airfield, and again, shouldn't have been there. And interestingly, in July 2017, the UK Department for Transport published a study on the effect of mid-air collision between drones and airplanes. And what they said was they knew the risk associated with bird strikes, and it's something that's been fairly closely studied. So they compared the effect of a drone collision with the effect of a bird strike. And they actually found that drones can cause significantly more damage than birds of an equivalent mass, even where the drone is travelling at a much lower speed. So again, with airspaces becoming more and more crowded, this is really something that's a big issue from a regulatory perspective, as much as anything else. So with that, I'll just hand over to Christine to tell you about drones and data privacy and data protection issues.
You might have heard a lot about the GDPR and the General Data Protection Regulation for those of you who aren't aware. And there's a lot of controversy and issues and implications arising from the GDPR. And in your industry, I'm going to talk about how data protection might be relevant. So first of all, in relation to drones, the expansion of drone technologies brings with it obviously a number of risks and challenges for both regulators, drone manufacturers and drone operators. And this is due to the threat to an individual's privacy. Unless drones are used with proper care and consideration, they can give rise to concerns that an individual's home or private life is being invaded. And this is really due to the height at which the drone operates, and also the vantage point which the height affords. But just to be clear, not all use of drones give rise to data protection issues, and it's only if the drone is collecting personal data. It's usually not the drone itself, it's usually the other equipment you buy and connect to the drone. For example, the cameras, etc., that could be the sensors, any GPS equipment that are collecting the personal data. So we'll go in, I'll talk a bit later about the GDPR, but right now we're just going to talk about current data protection legislation. The first question you need to ask yourself is, am I collecting personal data? If I am, well then I'm subject to data privacy laws. There's no specific harmonising law in Europe at the moment. The law we look to is the directive, the Data Protection Directive, and national implementing legislation. So in Ireland, it is the Data Protection Acts 1988 and 2003, which have been amended. So I think it's really important to understand what is personal data. I get asked this question all the time. Personal data, under the definition of the Acts, is data relating to a living individual who is or can be identified either from data or from the data in conjunction with other information that is in or is likely to come into the possession of a data controller, and can include facial images, car number plates, and other things that mightn't necessarily be in your industry, but an employee number, for example, could be personal data. An employee title can be personal data. Certain information combined with other information could also be personal data. So it's really any information from which an individual can be identified, which obviously can include sound as well, or the location of somebody and their image, but you might necessarily be able to recognise their face. It still could be considered to be personal data. So drones can be used for both commercial and private or personal use. And although we're probably more interested in the commercial use today, I think it's important just to talk about the personal use exemption. So if a drone is used solely for the management of personal, family, or household affairs, or kept by an individual for recreational use, it won't be subject to data privacy laws, and this is called the household exemption. However, this distinction between the household exemption and also commercial use has become slightly blurred, and this is due to a recent case from the European Court of Justice, in which the Czech Republic made a reference to the European Court of Justice with regard to private use of CCTV on a house. And the effect of this case meant that the household exemption would be restricted and would only apply where the use of the drone or the CCTV in this case was within the property. So if, for example, the CCTV or the drone you're using is outside your property, or even partially outside your property and in a public area, the exemption wouldn't apply. So that's just something to be aware about. How people get into difficulty in data protection is that they inadvertently capture personal data because maybe they don't understand the technology they're buying or the additional equipment they're buying and attaching to their drones. And it's really important now, and this is particularly given the fact there's huge financial sanctions if you breach data protection laws, that you're aware what you're buying, what you're operating, how you're operating, what type of data you're collecting. And the whole excuse of, oh, I didn't know, I wasn't aware, that's not going to float with the Data Protection Commissioner anymore, or any supervisory authority in the EU. So there are certain key data protection requirements relevant to the use of drones. They're set out kind of scattered in current data protection legislation, but what's also really interesting is the Data Protection Commissioner has actually come out with guidance on this area specifically for drone users, as has the Article 29 Working Party. If you haven't heard about the Article 29 Working Party before, they're a party in the EU Commission which is made up of a representative from each of the EU member states, and they come up with really helpful guidance on how to interpret data protection laws. Now, none of this guidance is binding, but I would say nearly all my clients comply with this guidance, so I would recommend that people take it into consideration when they're deciding whether or not or how they're going to interpret different data protection laws. So the key requirements identified as those which are relevant to drone users is first that the processing, so your collection of personal data, must be lawful. in order to be lawful, you have to rely on what we call a lawful processing ground. And this will be the same in the GDPR. So the first thing everyone always says, get consent from the data subject, get consent from the individual from whom you're collecting the personal data. This is really impractical for a surveyor sometimes, particularly if you're on a large project. How are you going to get consent of all these random individuals who happen to be in the vicinity of the area which you're operating your drone? Also, consent must be valid, must be freely given, it must be specific and informed. And under the GDPR, it will actually expand that consent requirement, and it is required to be an unambiguous indication of the individual's wishes by a statement or clear affirmative action. So this means this consent requirement is really difficult to comply with. So let's take a look at another processing basis. The next processing basis is it's necessary to perform a contract to which the data subject is a party. This would be relevant where, for example, it's used by an estate agent in a contract to sell a property. The estate agent may be taking a video of the property or an image of the property. The next one is it's necessary for legal or public interest reasons. I think that kind of speaks for itself. The next one is it's strictly necessary to protect the data subject's vital interests. For example, this would be in an emergency situation where you're trying to locate an individual. And the next one, which is probably most relevant for your industry, is that it's necessary for the purpose of legitimate interests pursued by the data controller. Examples here, I think, include drones used to survey critical infrastructure, for archaeological mapping, for environmental monitoring and things like that. But in this context, the data controller must implement appropriate safeguards, and the interests of the data controller must outweigh the data subject. So it's a balancing of rights situation. In saying all that, you're also required to be transparent. Transparency is one of the key requirements under data protection law. This means that individuals must be aware that they are being recorded. It's not an excuse to say, well, the drone's up in the air, how could they not see it? You must put up signage, hand out leaflets, put notices in papers. Some other suggestions are put your corporate logo on the drone, have a drone where you install a flashing light. So if, for example, it's very clear to individuals that there is a drone flying above, and also some drones might necessarily capture personal data. So there needs to be a difference between those that capture personal data and those that don't. So the individual is made very aware that their personal data and their images, etc., is being captured. So the next point is proportionality. The data you're collecting must be adequate, relevant, and not excessive. This is the concept of data minimization. You're not allowed to collect information that you don't need for the purpose for which you're collecting. So, for example, if drones are equipped with different technologies, for example, cameras, thermal imaging, GPS, motion, radio frequency, and you're picking up personal data because of those specific types of equipment or technology attached to your drone, and you don't need it, you're going to be in trouble under data protection laws, because you're only allowed to collect the limited amount of data necessary to achieve your purpose. Getting on now to security. Security is one of the key pillars in current data protection law and also under the GDPR. And you must ensure that you have appropriate security measures in place. Data captured and stored. So if the data you're capturing, there is personal data, you must make sure that your computer systems, for example, that you upload the images to are secured, that you have appropriate passwords in place, that employees who work for your organisations, that not everybody who has access to the information, only the people that are required to have access to this information can access it. So you have to have different levels of security. What's not okay anymore is to say, we weren't aware, or they accidentally accessed it. If someone accidentally accesses personal data that are not allowed to access, they're immediately in breach of the data protection laws. And as a controller, you are responsible and could face, come 25th of May, severe financial sanctions. You also are under an obligation now, come the 25th of May, to notify the Data Protection Commissioner when there's a data protection breach, if there's a high risk to the rights and freedoms of data subjects. One way kind of to educate employees, etc., about personal data is to make sure you have policies and procedures in place about operating drones, and just about educating people that if they are going out and using drones, that they understand the technology behind the drones, that they're not just relying on what someone else is saying to them, that they're going and reading the material, the manufacturer material, etc., to understand the capabilities of that particular drone. Data subject access requests are, I'd say, going to get more frequent. This is when a data subject, so an individual who might be captured as part of the data which the drone is capturing, requests a copy of their footage. To exercise this right, an individual just has to write to the data controller. It usually costs about €6.35. Not all controllers require the payment of that €6.35, and a data controller must respond to this request within 40 days. Under the GDPR, the fee has been abolished, but what's happening under the GDPR, because there's more enhanced rights and there's more focus on data subject rights under the GDPR, it's reducing the time limit to respond to requests to 30 days. And that's actually quite difficult, because you have to look through all your data and give them anything where they can be identified. And also, if, for example, they're on one piece of data and another individual is as well, you have to blur the other individual, because you're not allowed to give over information of others to a requester. Claims that you're unable to produce copies of footage, the Data Protection Commissioner has come out and said that won't work. That if you're a data controller and you're recording personal data, you're required to keep it in a secure manner if necessary, and to provide it on request. We're not sure how she's going to implement the sanctions under the GDPR for failure to comply with the request, or how much they will be, but it's very, very important to be aware about them. Another issue is your contracts with processors. If you've engaged as a contractor to provide a report to somebody, you may have contracts in place at the moment. If, as part of the activity, you're collecting personal data, you are required to have a written contract in place. And not only that, the GDPR brings mandatory requirements that must be included in your contracts. So it's very unlikely that your current contracts are up to date with the GDPR. So if you are collecting personal data on behalf of somebody else, or if you are engaging someone else to use a drone and provide an activity or a service for you, you have to go back and look at your contracts. I'll speak more about that a little bit later. Storage and retention, you're not allowed to collect data for no longer that is necessary for the purpose for which it is originally collected. You just must be able to justify why you're collecting that data and how long you're going to retain that data for. And then the final requirement, which the Data Protection Commissioner and the Article 29 Working Party highlighted, was to carry out privacy impact assessments. And that's particularly where you are using new innovative technology and you're collecting personal data, you're required to carry out these assessments. That's been formalised under GDPR, so now it's actually a legal requirement to carry them out under certain circumstances. So the GDPR, my favourite topic at the moment, it will come into effect on the 25th of May 2018. One of the key motivations behind the GDPR was the fact the old legislation was a directive, and with directives what happens is member states can implement the legislation whatever way they want. So we have all these different laws in different member states and no harmonising law. So it's very difficult when you're providing a service cross borders as to know which laws or which states are stricter in terms of sanctions or reporting requirements. So the GDPR as a regulation will be directly effective in member states. It's slightly different from other regulations in the sense that it's a hybrid. So it allows member states to implement derogations from the regulation by way of an act. In Ireland, we unfortunately won't make the GDPR deadline with our act. It's currently a draft bill and was published last month, but it's a kind of watch this space to see if there's any derogations in that act that could be of benefit to your industry when it is finally published. So the period between now and the 25th of May is actually the de facto transition period. The 25th of May is a hardline date. So if you're not compliant after the 25th of May, there are no excuses. You will be in breach of data protection laws if you collect personal data and you're not complying with the mandatory requirements. So I think the easiest way to summarise the GDPR and how it might be relevant to drone users or operators is to look at the key concepts. The first is privacy by design and by default. This means that if the notion that the means and purposes of personal data processing must be designed from the beginning. Default means that by default the drone must comply with data protection laws. Another concept is that of transparency and accountability. So controllers must be able to demonstrate compliance. And then moving on to the data protection impact assessments. Drones used for commercial purpose should conduct a data protection impact assessment according to the Data Protection Commissioner. However, under the GDPR, large-scale processing of personal data and any innovative use of technological solutions will be required to conduct a data protection impact assessment. I mentioned one of the reasons why the GDPR is so important is because it expands and clarifies individual rights. And I've listed some of them there. So individuals have the right to information, to access. You might have heard of the Google Spain case, the right to be forgotten, so the right to have their data erased from the systems which hold their data, and they're entitled to restrict processing. So for example, they could potentially restrict your use of a drone if your drone is collecting personal data, if it is in breach of data protection laws. So the question you need to ask yourself is, are you a controller or are you a processor? I think this is the one I find this industry sometimes isn't very clear on. If you are being instructed to provide a service, you potentially will be a data processor. You may collect data for your own purposes, but potentially not personal data. So a controller determines the purposes and the means of the processing, and a processor acts on the instructions of a controller, which is quite simple. The key obligations of the controllers under the GDPR haven't really been changed, they've just been increased. So if you are a controller now, you will be subject to the same obligations under the GDPR, but again, they'll be enhanced. So you'll have to maintain more extensive records, for example, of your processing activities. The concept of processor is essentially changed again under the GDPR. However, I mentioned there is a lot stricter requirements that processors have to have in their processing agreements with controllers. Some of these include that they must, you actually have to put in a contract that they're not allowed to act other than the documented instructions of the controller. They must comply with confidentiality obligations, and they must also ensure that any employees in their organisation comply with confidentiality obligations. So that would mean not only looking at your contracts with your service providers, but also making sure that your employees are subject to those written confidentiality obligations. That you must have there's another requirement that you must have appropriate technical and organisational measures in place, and at the controller's request, return or delete data. And one that is causing, I think, a bit of controversy is that you have to contribute to audits and also allow a controller to come in and audit to make sure that you are complying with data protection laws that you're obliged to comply with. So the big one is the penalties under the GDPR. There are currently few offences or sanctions for breach under current data protection laws. And in fact, if you breach current data protection laws, there's no legal requirement to notify the Data Protection Commissioner. She's just issued this non-binding guidance which recommends that you notify her if there is a breach. So the level of potential sanction will depend on the breach and will range from fines of up to 10 million, or in the case of an undertaking, 2% of its total worldwide annual turnover in the previous financial year, which is huge. With maximum penalties for intentional breach of the higher of 20 million up to 4% of an undertaking's worldwide turnover. So these penalties are obviously much more effective, proportionate and dissuasive, and again it's this whole concept of protecting the individual's rights and being transparent in your processing, so making sure you get those notices up, that you're complying with the lawful basis, that you understand the drones and the equipment you're buying, and understand the activity you're meant to be carrying out. So just going forward, a few tips is to conduct your data privacy impact assessments where required, figure out if you are collecting personal data, even inadvertently collecting personal data. That's where a lot of companies and individuals fall down. make sure that you have your data processing agreements in place, look at your policies and procedures, make sure they're updated to the GDPR. An interesting thing is that I had the Data Protection Commissioner come in for a talk in our offices in January, and one thing she did say is, from an Irish perspective, her office is really going to focus on documentation. So she will expect your documentation, whether even if it's your websites, your business websites, your terms and conditions, your cookies policies, all that has to be up to date and comply with GDPR from the 25th of May. So that's kind of the end of the data privacy section. I don't want to scare you, but it's just important to be aware and to kind of have knowledge about what's going on in the privacy world at the moment.
So just to conclude, what's on the horizon apart from GDPR? As we've said, really there's going to be increased regulation to keep pace with the technology. Whether or not the Irish bill comes into place, we are looking at increased regulation from a European perspective. Remains to be seen whether that's going to bring increased enforcement, although I would think that there will be an increase in enforcement as time goes on, particularly as technology develops to allow enforcement to keep up with drone operators and improvements in terms of identification and traceability. And also the potential for criminal liability to be introduced, which is very significant. I think we're certainly going to see an increase in the need for insurance, and it certainly looks like there is going to be a compulsory requirement for insurance. And I suppose in terms of the final word, there are challenges, there are risks. I don't think any of them are insurmountable. This is really, an exciting new world. There's lots of opportunities with drones, and not least for your industry. So it'll be really interesting to see how this continues to develop. So we're happy to take any questions, if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask.
Yes, from the online viewers.
Sure, go ahead.
Sorry, just you said about a drone with under a kilo, provided it doesn't go the meters. What happens if it's under a kilo?
Well, yeah, I mean, in that case, it would be subject to the regulations. The registration requirement is over a kilo, but you will be subject to the limitations that apply in the drones order. So under a kilo, the drones order doesn't apply at all once you're below 15 metres and not creating a hazard.
But if it goes above it?
Yeah, the limitations apply, but you wouldn't be required currently to register it.
Yes, opinion documents mentioned.
Mm.
Consultation with a few manufacturers. Is that what that document already found last week?
Yes, it has. And I know actually the SCSI is one of the organisations that participated in that consultation, and there were stakeholders from all over Europe. So what I did, this only came out, I think it's the 22nd of February that it was published, but it has taken all of the comments from the stakeholders and has fed that in, and it has made some changes in terms of the recommendations, particularly on the very technical requirements and how the categories are set up.
Is there any guidelines on liability amounts and things like that, public liability?
No, I would say talk to your broker probably on that, because it's very individual. It's very difficult. I mean, as a lawyer, I don't advise on adequacy of cover, but it's also difficult for brokers to do it, because it's very much going to depend on what the individual drone operator is doing. There are in terms of the insurers who are on the market, they're offering kind of limits at particular levels, for particular premiums, and they cover different things. So that kind of gives some guidance, but no, it is very much depending on your own requirements, unfortunately.
Do you think the GDPR rules will restrict the use of drones? I mean, if you're mapping in your files, you're going to be capturing personal data from adjacent properties and fields.
Yeah,
And
I think.
GDPR requires you to have consent up front.
Yeah, well, not necessarily. GDPR requires you to rely on a lawful basis. So you have to look at the lawful basis, and I mentioned contracts, I mentioned your legitimate interests. So it's really going to require drone operators to go back and see if there's anything else other than consent they can rely upon. And usually I advise that consent is quite a weak ground to rely on. The reason is an individual can obviously withdraw their consent, and also these really strict requirements of this affirmative action, and whether signs won't be good enough because the individual has to formally consent, and implied consent won't work. So there is a lot of, I think there's probably going to be a lot of guidance in this area. Well, hopefully, we're hoping for it, because there's still a lot of questions about how practical some of these GDPR requirements are for the various industries, your industry being one of them. So what I would say is you need to go back and look at the other lawful processing grounds and see if you can potentially rely on one of them. And again,
for aerial survey, some organisations, some state bodies have actually set letters and issued notices to the properties
Yeah.
removed, whereas if you're a private company,
It's
that's not
difficult.
really that practical.
And one of the suggestions from the Data Protection Commissioner is that, well, then you should get other equipment that they blur the images of individuals. There is this equipment around, but obviously, again, this could be very impractical depending on the size of your organisation, because this equipment is quite expensive. So when you're implementing the GDPR, you have to look at the cost, the risk associated. Is there a high risk to this, to the rights and freedoms of this data subject if I process their personal data? And if there is not, it's about kind of that balance of the lawful processing grounds, the risk associated with, and what your notification requirements are. And again, it's just to kind of keep your ear to the ground. The data protection bill is coming down the lines, or the data protection, when it's finally published, I think it's going to be October. So it will be interesting to see if there is any derogations that could be beneficial to this industry. At the moment, there isn't. So unfortunately, that's still where we're at. But there's a lot of useful papers. Again, Article 29 Working Party came out with useful guidance on drones and drone usage in the EU. So again, they might come out with something else in relation to the requirements of GDPR. What everyone is saying is do your privacy impact assessments, look at the lawful processing grounds, and buy the technology or the equipment attached to your drones that will avoid the unnecessary collection of personal data when you don't need it for a particular purpose.
If a client asks you to, as part of your service, to take some drone shots of their house or office or whatever land, does that automatically make you into a commercial drone operator to do that?
Yeah, so you are a contractor and you are a processor. You are providing a service to a client, so you would need to have an agreement in place, and your agreement would need to have the mandatory requirements in the agreement. Again, because they're a client and it's personal, it's kind of their house, etc. There might be heavy negotiations on the obligations between both your client as the controller and you as the processor. So yeah, you need to have those contracts in place.
And from a regulatory perspective, you're very likely, if you're taking photos of someone's house, to be outside the statutory limits, because it's a structure outside your control, but also in terms of other houses, other people, it's exactly. You're probably going to be into the realm of needing the special operating permission.
And then the other thing which seems to be contradictory is that you've got to retain all the information, or presumably the chips of the stuff you've done for as long as someone might come back and ask you about it again.
Well, it depends. You need to look at both the statutory and limitations on that. So you're only allowed to keep it for as long as it's necessary for the purpose. So if you already given the information to them, well, they have it. If you don't need it for your file anymore, you can delete it. However, if, for example, there's a contract, what we always say to clients is hold it for 7 years after the termination of the contract, because you've 7 years to bring a claim.
It's take back the thing that you've taken photographs of the house, and the sale goes through and that's all done and gone. You've got, like in any camera in your office, you've got a memory chip in it or whatever. Are you expected to hold, and going forward, even forgetting drones? Every photograph you take of every property you ever look at, any office building you go out for a rent review, are you meant to keep that for 7 years each? To keep those photographs for 7 years?
It just depends on the risk associated with keeping that data. If there's a possibility that a claim could be brought, if, for example, you haven't taken, if it's not accurate, and it could lead to a claim, you'll be protecting yourself by holding that data. But you're only required to hold it for the amount that is necessary for the purpose for which you've obtained it. So again,
Typically, a sale of a property, you'd say until it's closed.
exactly,
and gone,
there you go.
then
Well, then you should be
deleted.
deleting it securely, and making sure that you do have, what's very useful is to have a data destruction policy in place, which could be a 2-page document, which which kind of informs both your clients and both your employees as well, how they must destroy that kind of information. If it's personal data, if it's not personal data, it's a bit different. So it's just if it contains personal data. But what you could do as well is though you could cull or redact some of the personal data by blurring images, or encrypt it or things like that. So there is different ways around it. And again,
We're only humble state agents, really.
yeah, and see, this is the issue is that some of the requirements could lead to huge cost implications. So it's trying to figure out what's the most practical solution for your organisation.
And I just, leaving again drones aside, from a professional indemnity perspective, I would, your insurers will always ask you what are your data retention policies. So obviously you need to make sure that you're doing whatever you've said in the context of your professional indemnity insurance that you're doing.
Just actually with regards, like, kind of the word line up where it becomes personal information and not. So with regards, like, the like of a large scale aerial survey or drone surveys, where I know this question came up recently enough on previous work, was at what stage is information like the imagery of a backyard in a large scale aerial survey is that coming under the grant of personal information because it's captured subsequent to this large aerial survey?
No, it's if there's any data in there that someone could be identified by. So for example, if you're capturing a garden and there's a car parked in the driveway and you can see the car registration number, well, the car registration number is the personal data in that. So it's just to make sure that you're not inadvertently capturing, for example, the car registration number, or sometimes people are capturing individuals inside windows and there's a blurred image but they can be identified from it. So it's just making sure that information isn't captured.
Yeah, just on the second one, just with regards, kind of, because it would be capture of personal data, but so there's going forward, there's kind of looks into going into drone automation, going into managing drone airspace. One of the means is looking at extra sensors for kind of a degree of awareness within the drones. So while they're flying along, maybe kind of object detection and stuff like that. So some of them can be done through using imaging sensors or some
Yeah.
standard cameras. Now, I'm assuming the idea would be that used for that purpose, if the imagery is destroyed straight after, it's not exactly.
If there was.
So if the premise would be that imagery would be used for the likes of object detection for like collision avoidance. But if it's just say the likes of drone transport or something like that, or delivery, if the imagery in that case is destroyed immediately after because it was only used for detecting structure, not actually recording the entire duration of the flight, I'm assuming that wouldn't fall too much under.
No, but again, it just comes down to whether or not any individuals can be identified. So even though you have these sensors in place, some of the sensors, they can be extremely clear,
Yeah.
and you can identify
Yeah.
people. So it's making sure that that kind of those whether it's heat detection sensors or anything like that, that you again can't identify anybody from it. If anyone can identify an individual from that image,
Yeah.
your answer is yeah, it comes under personal data.
In this case, there could be something where, yes, in the immediate image captured by the drone, it would be someone identified, but as the process is run through, it immediately destroys it because it's an X that it doesn't actually need.
It's still because you're still collecting personal data, you do come under unfortunately the acts, but the fact you have this destruction policy in place, that's one of the things that the Data Protection Commissioner has actually recommended you do. So you're actually following the guidance and having these solutions in place that do delete it very quickly. So yeah, you are collecting data, but the risk to individuals is very low because you have this deletion solution in place.
Yeah.